Hi everyone, this is Sam Black with Drafting Archetypes, and today I'm going to be discussing multicolor green decks in Foundations. As always, the notes are available to follow along at patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. This is going to be one of those all vibes, no data archetypes where I just talk about like an idea that I have about a deck that I like to draft that doesn't really follow the win rates of cards, and I can't point to any data that speaks to the success of this way of drafting in the format because there's no way to isolate that. So I'm going to explain what I'm trying to do in this archetype and why. As to whether it's a good thing to do, I can explain why it makes sense, but I can't point to, and then if you do this, you win this portion of the time or whatever. That's not what's going on here. A lot of the cards that I'm looking for individually are not the best performing cards, but that's because I have a clear idea of what I'm trying to do with them, and I think that they're the cards that are best at letting me play that kind of game plan. So the basic idea here is to just play all of the removal you can find and all of the strong rares you can find, and then try to build a deck that cohesively supports that. Basically saying, all right, let's assume that this is like a Prince format and the only thing that matters is having like good bombs and good uncommons and being able to interact with your opponents' good bombs and good uncommons. And so you want a lot of removal, and you want to be able to put every powerful card that you see in the draft into your deck. So you need to prioritize fixing kind of like preemptively to be able to take advantage of any rares or removal that you find. And your mana is still potentially going to be pretty questionable, but if the game goes long enough, that doesn't matter. You'll eventually draw the mana to cast the cards that you need to win the game, as long as you can avoid losing before then. So the support for the deck at common outside of removal is basically fixing and defensive creatures. Creatures that are like your basic goal is to generate a board stall, to stop the game from progressing, to give you time to find your mana and find your powerful cards. So the green commons that you're looking for, in approximate order of how much you're looking for them, but this is very subject to change depending on your curve, your mana needs, how much of everything you have. But you like Treetop Snare Spinner, the 3 and a green 1/4 reach death touch spider that you can spend 2 and a green to put a +1/+1 counter on something at sorcery speed, is, I think, the best green common for this archetype. It is very far from the best performing green common in aggregate because it doesn't attack very well, but it does block extremely well. And most of the green decks in aggregate in this format are on the more aggressive side. But when you're not on the more aggressive side and you're just trying to block, nothing blocks as well as Snare Spinner, and the activated ability that functions as a mana sink does provide a meaningful advantage as the game goes long if you succeed at generating a board stall, which Treetop Snare Spinners is like the best common at generating. So, huge overperformer and a key piece that you're looking for if you're drafting in this space. Grow from the Ashes, the 2 and a green, search your library for a basic land, put it into play, kicker, 2 colorless. If you kick it, do it again, search for another basic and put it into play, untapped, is not a very good card. Incidentally, the worst performing green common. But if your mana needs a lot of help, it helps more than anything else. if you're trying to splash cards that cost 2 colored mana of the same color, you can actually do that with Grow from the Ashes, and it's very hard to do otherwise. So how much you're looking for Grow from the Ashes will vary a lot depending on how good your fixing is relative to your requirements. It's like a weak, high leverage way to fix, like low power level, high effectiveness. Next, Llanowar Elves, a strong green card that helps you play your kind of, Forgive is having a clunkier curve, but it requires green mana and gives you green mana, so it doesn't work very well in terms of like fixing, and it doesn't play well with sweepers, and the tempo that it generates doesn't matter if you succeed at causing a board stall, and you really can't ever play it over a land because it's not helping your colored source situation and is meaningfully lower impact when you draw it late than any other spell that might be in your deck. So it's a kind of high variance card that I think if you have it, you can draft to take advantage of it, but there's a lot that it's doing that's not really what you want, so it's not a very high priority for me. Bushwhack is somewhere between fixing and removal, not great at either, but good enough at both that you want to play it, because those are like the two things that your deck wants most. I still don't like to take it early because it's not great at anything that it does, and I don't think other people want it very much, so I'm hoping to table it. And then Bite Down pairs super well with Treetop Snare Spinners, since the Death Touch works with Bite Down and lets you kill anything. But you have the normal problems that you have in these control decks where you might not be planning to play like a lot of early creatures and it won't work some portion of the time. So I think it's acceptable support for your removal package, but worse than most other removal. So I want it, but I'd rather splash an effective removal spell from another color than take a Bite Down most of the time. The other creatures in green, like the 2/1 or the 3/1 for 2 that surveils when it enters or dies, or the 4/2 flash that exiles a card from the graveyard, or the 5/3 reach that makes an elf with landfall. Those are all like acceptable filler. Play them as your curve demands. You might prioritize them over creatures from other colors depending on your colored mana situation, but none of them are priorities. I'm not going to take any of them over a useful card in any color. I don't consider them in any way like important for the deck, but they're fine ways to fill it out, especially if you end up with a lot of green fixing and want to bias your mana toward green. Then having more of these like green early creatures can help you not just like get run over. So those are the green cards that I'm looking for. Evolving Wilds is among the best commons. I think it's competitive with premium removal. I'm always going to consider taking Evolving Wilds in any pack early in a draft, basically regardless of what I'm drafting, but certainly if I think that I'm in this archetype or likely to be in this archetype, unless I'm at a point where I'm really desperate for removal or it's like, a bomb or something, I'm very often just going to take an Evolving Wilds if I see it. The other dual lands are priorities, but much lower priorities than Evolving Wilds. Where you want those varies a lot depending on whether it's giving you a potential flex in the future versus supporting cards that you already have and you're definitely playing, and how good your mana is, how good your removal is. the exact like line on like which removal spell do you take over which land or whatever varies a lot and is not easy to give rules for. The other commons you're looking for, roughly in order of how much you want them: Luminous Rebuke, the 5 mana white removal spell that only costs 2 if it's killing a tapped creature instant. Banishing Light, the white enchantment that I thought was something else in play. Burst Lightning, the red, deal 2 for single red with kicker 4 to deal 4. Stab, the black instant gives -1/-1. Incinerating Blast, the red 4 and a red sorcery that deals 6 damage, and then you can discard a card and draw a card. Followed by Bake into a Pie. Bake into a Pie is a much stronger card than Incinerating Blast, but single red on 5 is so much easier than double black on 4 that if I'm not in either color already, I would prefer to take the blast and stretch my mana less. But this changes a lot if you are already playing some black cards. Bake into a Pie is the black 2, destroy a creature, make a food. Followed by Big Fin Bouncer, 3 and a blue, for a 3/2 ETB bounce something. Uncharted Voyage, put a creature on top or bottom of its owner's library, surveil 1. So what's going on there is, those are basically like the removal spells in the other colors. You want the white ones most because there are 2 really strong white removal spells. They both kill anything and they're both single white. So that's what I'm most likely to splash, or that's like my most likely other color to play, because the removal spells are exactly what I want. And so I take each of them higher, anticipating that I'm more likely to see more of the other one. And then Burst Lightning I take over Stab because it can be kicked, and because Incinerating Blast is single red, where Bacon... Oh, I forgot to mention Eaten Alive. Eaten Alive is like behind Bake, possibly ahead of Big Fin Bouncer. It's tricky because you're not very likely to have creatures that you want to sack, but sometimes you will. I think most of the time you're just not taking it high enough to plan to get it in this archetype because other archetypes use it better, but it is a reasonable card to play. So anyway, like, I think that you're going to slightly prefer red to black because its removal is a little bit more splashable. But if you already have a black card and you don't have a red card, then you should take Stab over Burst Lightning. It's all very flexible. And it's basically just, you want removal spells and you want to be able to cast them. And before you know which colors you are, slight bias toward white over red over black over blue. It's unusual to be prioritizing blue this low in like a multicolor control deck. What's happening here is that Think Twice is much worse than Divination for this kind of deck, and Refute is strategically one of the cards that you'd want more, but early blue is not realistic. And so the cards that you want are like Bouncer and Voyage, which are like blue's removal. Witness Protection also acceptable, but not a priority because it's just not very strong. And you're not like, you want real removal. You want hard removal. Bouncing and putting stuff on top of their deck isn't as good when you're planning to just like have a board stall and have the game go really, really long. So they're okay cards to play, but they're worse than the removal in other colors. And the card draw, like, so much of the power in blue costs double blue, like Arcane Epiphany and Refute, that since I don't expect my mana to support that well, I'd kind of rather just stay out of it. So blue is the color that I'm least likely to play, with some exceptions. I'm very happy to splash for Tatiova. I'll take that over almost anything. Spectral Sailor is another card that plays super, super well here. The 1 mana 1/1 flash flyer. you can spend blue and 3 to draw a card, is another card that's very worth splashing in this archetype. So there are uncommons in blue that I'm happy to splash, and I'm fine playing blue as a 5th color or whatever, but I don't want to plan to have to find early blue, and I would rather my removal come from other colors. So your loose preference order: bombs, followed by removal, followed by fixing, followed by creatures. But removal and fixing are really a lot more integrated in the pick order, where, premium removal over medium fixing, over medium removal, over weaker fixing. There's not a clear always take the removal spell or always take the fixing, and they're just not all created equal. So the next thing to cover is which creatures to play. And I think that this part's really important. You're basically looking for creatures that block well and that do something, like that have meaningful text boxes. So Treetop Snare Spinners, I think, is the best. This is going to be, again, in an order that's super, super, super loosely based on like how much I expect to want it early, but especially with creatures, like your colored mana situation, like how easy they are to cast, and your curve matters a lot more than the details about like which common creature it is. So huge grain of salt, but Snare Spinners, super premium, just the best creature for this space at common. Followed by Dazzling Angel, which I think is kind of the most similar to Treetop Snare Spinners. Blocks well, the flying helps with, blocking flyers, and the life gain helps with extending the game. 2/3 for 3 is just a pretty acceptable stat line, and then when you add the life gain and the flying, it becomes very good. Big Fin Bouncer, I listed this among removal, which in general I want removal over creatures. This is a little bit of both. It's definitely a creature that does something. So as far as like where that removal cluster integrates into this creature cluster, Big Fin Bouncer I think is like the 3rd best common creature, assuming that it fits well into your curve and color requirements. Squad Rallier. This is another one that I'm prioritizing much more highly than its like aggregate win rate would suggest. Again, it just does exactly what I want. 3/4 blocks reasonably well, and I really prioritize having a mana sink since my whole deck is about generating a board stall. I want something that's going to give me an advantage as the game goes along after I've generated the board stall. Whether I want Squad Rallier is going to really depend on how many creatures I have that it finds, and Squad Rallier can meaningfully inform how much I'm prioritizing other creatures. If you can, find high impact creatures that have 2 power or less, like Treetop Snare Spinner, Dazzling Angel, Guarded Air, Felidar Savior. If you have a bunch of that stuff, then Squad Rallier is really, really good. If instead your 2-drops are things like Wary Thespian, the 3/1, and you're like, it's possible to have a deck where all of your cheap and expensive creatures are found by Squad Rallier, and it's possible to have a deck where none of your creatures at all are found by Squad Rallier. And if you're in a spot where you think you're going to play some Squad Ralliers, go out of your way a little to bias your creatures toward being things that Squad Rallier can find. It's worth it. The advantage that you get from Squad Rallier's impact in the board stalls you're trying to generate is really big. Next up, Felidar Savior, the 4-mana 2/3 lifelink that gives up to 2 other creatures +1/+1 counters when it enters. It's a creature that does something. The life gain matters. The ETB ability helps. It's good with Squad Rallier. Then Llanowar Elves, Gorehorn Raider, the 4 and a red 4/4 that when it enters, if you raided, does 2 damage to anything. Icewind Elemental, the 4 and a blue 3/4 flyer that loots when it enters. Helpful Hunter, the 1 and a white 1/1 that draws a card. Strix Lookout, the 1/2 flying vigilance blue looter. Wary Thespian, the 3/1 surveil creature. And then stuff like Light Shell Duo, the 4 mana surveil 2 prowess 3/4. Soul Shackled Zombie, the 3 and a black 4/2 ETB, exile up to 2 cards from a graveyard, drain your opponent for 2 if you exiled a creature. Prideful Parent, the 2 and a white 2/2 that makes it 1/1, and Ambush Wolf, the flash 4/2 that exiles something. Approximate order, not necessarily an exhaustive list, more to demonstrate like the kinds of creatures you're looking for, the sorts of like kind of what I mean by creatures that do something. A lot of activated abilities, a lot of enter the battlefield abilities, and generally creatures that block well. You can splash cards that cost double pip, like, black or whatever. I've had a successful 5-color deck where like the only black card was the 5/5 mythic that flyer that gains life whenever your opponent loses life. But you have to like work for it if you're going to make that kind of splash. Again, that's mostly going to be prioritizing growth from the ashes. Card draw is a relatively low priority. It's not that drawing cards is bad, it's that the ways to do it in the format aren't good enough to be worth prioritizing. So blue is the color you're least interested in, and that's fine. Your goal is basically just establish a board stall with defensive creatures and removal, use the time to draw the lands to cast all your stuff, win with activated abilities of your creatures or just higher rarity cards. Some uncommons that are particularly strong here. Obviously, just like all the good uncommons are good, these are ones that I think are slightly better in this archetype than they are in aggregate. Spectral Sailor, I already mentioned, the 1/1 flash flyer that can draw cards. Dreadwing Scavenger, it's a little, this one is mostly just like great wherever, but I didn't want to not mention it. It's the best uncommon. 1 blue-black, 2/2 flyer, ETB or attack, loot, and then gets +1/+1 in Death Touch if you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard. Elvish Regrower, the green creature that picks up a permanent from your graveyard when it enters for 2 and 2 green. Zombify, 3 and a black, return a creature from your graveyard to the battlefield. Zombify is particularly good here because you're more likely to have like creatures that are worth getting back, and you have some amount of like rummaging and looting some portion of the time, but more it's just like, there are some combos with it, some abilities to do exceptional things, and sometimes it's just like, well, my Tatiova died, and now I can get it back, and that's great. Speaking of Tatiova and Meteor Golem, the 7 mana 3/3 that destroys something when it enters, you're looking for just like the normally good uncommons, like removal and creatures with good enters the battlefield abilities. That's what I got. That's the rundown. So I'm going to turn this over to Twitch chat for questions. First, I want to thank Andrew, my newest patron, at patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. So Andrew, thank you very much for the support. If anyone else is looking to support the podcast, check out patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. And now, chat, if you have anything you'd like me to discuss, now's the time for questions. This archetype seems strategically similar to your usual blue-based control strategy. Is that accurate? So, there's a lot in common, obviously. Like, both decks are being drafted toward inevitability. I think that the blue decks in this format are small game decks, and the green decks are big game decks, and that's true in a lot of formats. What I mean by that is the blue wants to just exchange resources as much as possible and draw extra cards to break parity, and it's trying to keep the board relatively empty, where the green deck is a lot more concerned with virtual rather than practical card advantage, meaning that you're trying to like have a board where maybe your opponent has 5 creatures and you have 2 or 3, but your opponent's creatures don't do anything and yours do. In that you have like a tree stop snare spinner and a squad rallier, and that's stopping your opponent from attacking while letting you spend mana productively. And so your creatures have an impact while your opponent's doesn't, because none of the creatures are attacking at all, but yours do something without attacking. Also, you have virtual card advantage because you just have fewer of your resources tied up in being creatures that are on the battlefield not attacking. So you might have more cards in your hand, more mana, whatever. So, yeah, basically, like, they're strategically similar decks that are focused on, like, raw power level of your cards, inevitability, stuff that I generally like to look for in my drafts. But they're different in that if you glance over at the battlefield at any given time, they're going to look really different. But they're both planning to play long games that, win on turn like 8 to 13 or something. And they're both like not really concerned with attacking, and they're going to value similar support cards like removal, but the way that they interact with like mana and creatures and like the general battlefield is pretty different, and that leads to prioritizing creatures differently, fixing differently, looking for different kinds of creatures. And I kind of keep coming back to this theme in different sets where I like these multicolor decks, but blue and green want very different kinds of multicolor decks. And I think it like breaks down in roughly this way most of the time. And this is why in a lot of sets I keep coming back to, oh, I actually don't want green in my multicolor decks because of how the green cards don't support like the blue multicolor game plan. But also sometimes I draft these green multicolor decks because like green has really good fixing. And these are just like it's so weird that there are these like two decks that have so much in common, but kind of like go worst when you try to draft them together. Like I want like green splashing everything or blue splashing everything, which is particularly interesting in the world where Wizards keeps promoting like blue-green base as like the multicolor archetype. And I kind of want to like pick one of those and splash around it. So that's and so as to the second question, what's different in this set that makes green appealing? It's almost what's similar in this set that makes green appealing to the other sets where multicolor green is appealing. And I think just in most sets where I've liked the multicolor blue decks, there's just also a different multicolor green deck that I like. It's different in like exactly these same ways. So the draw to multicolor green is that green usually offers good defensive creatures and good fixing, and lets you have this like board presence heavy virtual card advantage focused long like control game that just has those differences from the blue control game. What does the number of green cards in this deck tend to look like? Are there good versions that don't go deep into green outside of fixing? So splashing for fixing is a kind of important concept to be aware of in multicolor decks, and it's generally bad to do it. Like, if you have like a, Esper deck and you have some Evolving Wilds and then you play a Forest so that you can play 2 Grow from the Ashes to fix for your Esper mana, like you could just not bother with any of that and play some lands in your colors instead. So, like, the idea here isn't, hey, don't play the multicolored blue deck, play this instead. It's, here are 2 different ways to navigate multicolor decks, and it's really important to know about both of them because a lot of drafts will start by prioritizing removal and dual lands, and then whether you're in the like blue style or green style can be figured out later. I went over the green cards that you're looking for. As far as like what's the draw outside of fixing, so the green commons that I mentioned are treetop snare spinners, growth in the ashes, llanowar elves, bushwhack, and bite down, and then the like other filler creatures. The big draw genuinely is treetop snare spinners, but there's other stuff like affectionate Indrik and just like green. I guess the big selling point to green in this format is that it doesn't do well. And people aren't trying to draft it. And a lot of the time, green is just really open. And so if you can get late treetop snare spinners and just like, filler two drops like Wary Thespians that let you have like reasonably high card quality and a reasonably good curve with good mana because of the fixing, then green's a great place to be. So a big part of the draw to it is really just it being undervalued and being able to like pick up some equity there. Also, like Elvish Regrower is just a fantastic card that you never going to have access to in like the blue version, but the green version is super happy about. So that's kind of the draw to being aware of or looking for green. Since you're wanting a board stall, is Rebuke the best removal for this style of deck? Yes, I listed Rebuke as the all else equal highest pick removal spell. Rebuke followed by Vanishing Light. Is this deck interested in combat tricks to back up the defensive creatures like MKM, like with MKM Esper Flyers? No. There aren't combat tricks that generate meaningful advantage. Like, Fake Your Own Death is the closest, right? Because it gives you an extra object and retriggers an ETB from a creature. But the problem with combat tricks in defensive decks is that you're looking to use them on your opponent's turn, and combat tricks on your opponent's turn are just risky. Like, your opponent's going to have open mana when they're engaging in combat on your turn, and if your plan is to, like, block and trick, then your opponent can, like, trump your trick with their own trick or removal spell or something. And you are also like running into the fight spell problem where you're basically trying to answer a creature with your combat trick, and you need to have a creature and like have combat work out to let you do that. The advantages to combat tricks in general are that they can like double as direct damage to your opponent, and that they're like very tempo positive when you can like double spell with them. But this deck doesn't take advantage of either of those things, so combat tricks are basically just like bad removal spells here, and you should have access to enough removal spells without them. There are basically no combat tricks that should ever end up in your deck here. Are you typically taking non-green cards early in each pack and then planning to wheel green cards? Ideally, yes. I think you want to go into this space when green is open. The draft that I did on stream right before recording this podcast, I first picked a Day of Judgment, second and third picked Evolving Wilds, was very much planning to be in this space, just never saw any late good green cards. Green just like wasn't open, and I ended up Esper Control instead. And the strength of drafting this kind of thing is that you can really seamlessly pivot into, whatever base color ends up being open. And so you don't want to like try to force screen. And I guess that's actually something that I was thinking about that I didn't talk about precisely, which is that kind of like a thing about drafting multicolor green here is I really like the archetype. I think it's pretty good when you get the snare spinners and the fixing and stuff, but it's been very hard for me to navigate my way into. I played my first snare spinner ever like yesterday, because if you're drafting with an awareness of the win rates of the cards in the format, and you're trying to, take cards that win a lot early because you just want to have like powerful cards, there are very, very, very few green cards that are going to like put you into green early. And so then how do you get to green? What green card are you seeing that makes you pivot from something else into green? And that's hard too. Like, even when green's open, because there aren't any exceptional green cards, by the time you want to take a green card, you've kind of already figured out two other colors. And so this is a difficult space to navigate to. I think in general, it's hard to like be in green in this set, even though sometimes you want to, because it's good enough that it does well when it's underdrafted, but there's like nothing to tell you to go into it early. So the easy way to end up in a green deck, the way I suspect most people end up in green decks, is they start on a single color, and then in the middle of pack one, the best card is green, and then they end up in a two-color green lane. Or they open like one of a couple like really good green bombs. But this like navigating into the multicolor green space is kind of like tricky and unusual, and I think it basically doesn't happen unless you decide to really prioritize Treetop Snare Spinner, which I think is worth doing. And I think basically once you take Treetop Snare Spinner as like a premium card, then that lets you kind of like navigate into green appreciably more often. Do I like Rogue's Passage in this archetype based on it being good in a board stall? No. As pointed out, it's bad for multicolor fixing. Also, I don't anticipate needing the help to win a game. I think Rogue's Passage is reasonable if you're like an aggressive red-green deck that's going to like get your opponent relatively low on life and then like have a big creature but maybe be like losing a race to flyers and chump blockers or something. This deck doesn't care about trying to like push a creature through opposing blockers because I expect to just do something like that goes way over the top to win instead. Drown my opponent in cards, play like a Shivan Dragon or something. Like you should basically never like Rogue's Passage should never win you any games. The games that where you're in a spot where you can actually invest mana into attacking are games where you've like lived through the early game and you've reached the point of the game where you've won regardless. And having a land that taps for colors can absolutely lose you games very easily. All right, it looks like that covers the questions, so I'm going to wrap it up there. Thanks everyone for listening. Thanks chat for the questions, and I will be back next week with more Foundations coverage. Pioneer Masters is out on Arena, and I've gotten some questions about it. My general way of doing things is to only cover paper releases because I want to not just be speaking to the Arena playing audience. I think, but I'm not sure. Basically, I'm not sure how much of my audience is Arena players. So I might at some point put up a poll about whether people want any Pioneer Masters coverage. So yeah, I just wanted to address that, and I will figure it out. Stay tuned to see where we end up deciding to go with that. Thanks again for listening. Have a good week, and I'll see you next week. Bye for now.
Prepare for light speed.